Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So I want to welcome you into our pursuit of looking over Jesus' shoulder and around the proverbial room. We are looking in Mark 4. And so I feel like I'm always doing some pseudo-apology for chronology. We're trying to follow in time. And so there's just not clarity on when he shared this block of parables that we just processed through over the last 6-7 weeks. Mm-hmm. Last episode, we talked about his mother and brothers. And so I think in general, just to think that the flow here has been Jesus starts teaching, he does healing, people are drawn in. And then some of the people that should have accepted him, his hometown people, his mom, his siblings, are not, And so I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind is because I think a lot of times we think, well, if I'm with God, then I'm pleasing people and I've got a great reputation. And there are passages that say I have a great reputation, but I think that's very interesting. And now we're about to enter into an action-packed, there's multiple things that will happen over the next episodes. And these tend to be very well-known stories that we're going to process through. And so this one starts in verse 35 of Mark. But before we jump in, sure. Connor, what would you give us to help enrich our look?
Yeah, so let's say two things, and we'll see if I expand it out to 5 or 6 or 7. First and foremost, I think it's a good place to put our minds that we have kind of a implicit. We live in a very lucky time where we feel very aggrieved and angry when our weathermen get things wrong, when they're even slightly off on the timing of a storm or the severity or lack thereof. We get outraged at weather forecasters when they get things wrong. And so, one, I want to honor the people that lived in Jesus' time. They didn't have weathermen with fancy boards behind them, and so. Storms being predictable, not being predictable. This would have been something you were afraid of all the time, especially if you were, a fisherman at sea. And also recognizing, so you don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know how it's going to happen. Now you can tell some signs as you get closer and closer to the possible storm, but we know, okay, if there's going to be, a couple weeks ago, there was a bunch of possible tornado warnings that were going to pop up. And at least in Tulsa, we knew 3-4 days out that, hey, Wednesday night or Tuesday, whatever night it was, there could be a problem. So we planned our life accordingly around that. That's not their reality. The second thing is weather events had a spiritual significance to them that we don't necessarily feel today. There was, and I think there's a part of this where we can even go, man, I think that they have maybe a better understanding of where we might have a better understanding of what makes weather patterns. They have a greater respect and understanding for where God is and where the spiritual powers are when they thought about the different weather patterns that might affect their lives. In fact, like the idea of a storm coming and wiping people out, or a storm or raining, or there being a drought or whatever, they would have seen weather events as directly connected to God, where we might think about it eventually. We might pray to God for safety or whatever. The control of weather events, that's like at least in my understanding, and I could be wrong. My understanding is that for the Israelite at this time, the controlling of weather patterns is about as godly of an act as you possibly could, as you could get. And so that's my framing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I love that. I think that it is fascinating. Of course, not all the apostles were fishermen. We know that 4 of them, at the very least, were very active, and that was their livelihood. So we assume they were really good at it, generally speaking. But it is that picture of, and I've never thought about that before, is it was part of their job to read the weather. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that it strikes me as, I don't have this experience in real life, but I watch TV where it's like, anybody around here a tracker, and they're like, the tracker gets in front and they read, oh, look at how this branch is bent. It's
yeah.
like there was a party of 7 and they had a squabble and discussed the finer points of coffee, grinds. And I'm like, oh, that's amazing. So I think that's how it would be around them. And it also strikes me that one of Jesus' first interactions with them was he didn't know how to read the room in terms of being out on the water, because he's like, hey, we should go fishing. And they're like, no, we shouldn't,
Yeah.
And so even those first words that we're going to read here in a second, were the apostles going, now, were they at least the fishermen going, now you know what, and so how does that affect them, as this story unfolds? So that actually raises the fascination element of it for me. So as we read, I don't know if we say this explicitly much, but I would encourage you, the listener, clear your mind. Pretend for a moment that you've never read or heard this story before, and it's just literature that's been put in front of you, and you're asking God, teach me something, And so our lenses, of course, are watching for what amazes you and what perplexes you. But just in general, I would encourage you, what if you never heard this story before? What would stick out to you? So beginning in verse 35, it says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, and that's Jesus, we know that from previous context, he said, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. I'm judging my intonation there. Even the winds and waves obey him. Maybe that's better. There you go. So, what stands out to you? What amazes you about this?
So the first silly thing that popped into my mind, this is the first thing that popped in my mind in general, so I wasn't prioritizing silly necessarily. But I just want to remark about how great of a sleeper Jesus is. And then I was like, wait, is for Jesus, like, is he like how modern day children need like sound machines that sound like a jet engine in their ears? Is this Jesus' ideal sleeping conditions, or is he so exhausted? Or, usually when I hear people talk about, well, Jesus sleeping, there's some sort of deep spiritual, of how comfortable he is and how much he trusts the Father. And I think, yeah, it's true. But like, maybe I would love to find out that, like, in heaven, like, talking to the disciples, like, we just got it in that one time. Jesus was always napping, always sleeping, anywhere, uncomfortable. And I think it's important. This also was an important context. It's important for me. I have to actively remind myself when we talk about like a boat. My natural picture is more of a modern boat, or it's like a 18th century pirate ship or whatever. Like, that's not at all what this is. And so, closer to dinghy than it is like even 1800, 1800s pirate ship or whatever. But what amazes me, seriously, well, I was serious about the silliness of that. But what amazes me even more than that, is it says that Jesus wakes up and he rebukes the storm. And this isn't like Jesus rolls up his sleeves, he does 3 twirls in the air, spits in somebody's eye, and then the miracle happens. This is hey, hush, and the waves and the wind obey him. And I think about the temptation for what that would always be like. Like, Jesus, if Jesus can do this, and he wants to travel across the sea, he can call a wind that pushes him faster. He can, I never even thought about this, but on the night that he was to be handed over, Jesus would have had the power to call a storm to possibly make it harder for the Pharisees to come find him. This power that is at the I was gonna say fingertips or the lips of Jesus is so astounding, and so would be so all encompassing. And for Jesus to hold this power so I don't know if lightly is the right term, but he's not like I think about the miracles that we see people participating in, like that happen in the in the book of Acts, or in the New Testament in general. And I'm just astounded that Jesus could do this, and then the rest of his ministry is not weather pattern, projection, and that he doesn't go off and start, go off to all the I'm just like, the fact that he does this and it doesn't consume him is wild. I don't even have a headspace for it.
Yeah, I think I was thinking, and this goes to even what you're saying earlier, for the four fishermen, for Peter, Andrew, James, and John, how many times had they been at sea since they were little kids, and they were probably in their 20s at this point, or younger, but how many times had they wished away a storm? Had they wanted to,
that's good.
It's now storming, and I know, we can't even pay rent, and how are we going to deal with this? Or maybe wanted a storm. Dad wants me to get up at 2 a.m, you know what I mean? And they're like, oh, if only. So this is something they would have thought of a lot. The other thing I'm recognizing, and this is my bias that I'm bringing to the text, is that when it says the disciples, it doesn't say which disciples, but my assumption is, and right or wrong, that once they're in a boat, everyone defers to the fishermen, and I think it's a reasonable and yet unproven thought. And so I see the fishermen are the ones that are like, if I'm in a situation and I don't have skill, then I'm looking to the ones that at least I think have skill. And we have a friend named Daniel Lott. And when Daniel was little, I was teaching a class, and he was probably 12 or 13. And I go, what worries you? And he goes, my mom always says when she's driving, and then make whatever judgment you want about that, but that if I make a sound like it looks like I'm afraid, she turns to me very sternly and says, if I'm not afraid, you don't need to be afraid. and so I'm like, yeah, that's how I feel, because if I were in that boat, I'd look to the fishermen and be like, should we be scared? And so to me, it's not necessarily solely the fishermen that are saying, hey, why don't you save us? But it is educated by their expertise not being adequate, And so that's a fascinating wrinkle to me of what you're saying, is that whole idea of how powerful he is, and then shifting to, from Jesus' perspective, how tempting it would be. He does say, hey, at some point in his time in the garden, so right before his crucifixion, say, I could call 10 legions of angels, which isn't 10,000 angels. It's a legion is like 15,000 or something, So he could basically, I can call thousands and thousands of angels. I don't have to put up with any of this. And it reminds me of an illustration a teacher gave. It's like, when we think of Jesus as having to endure all this, we have a certain perception. Like if you were walking across traffic and were blind, how scary that would be in dodging. But what if you had your sight and then only had a blindfold? As soon as you hear that first car, the blindfold would come off. So to be self-restrained in that way, not to use the fullness of the power you have access to, and I think that's true. Philippians says he emptied himself of it. But he's saying, I have access to this power all the time, that I can use it myself. So yeah, that temptation would be so hard to fight, just for your own convenience, in simple, small ways. So that is fascinating.
Yeah, well, and I think about, I'm wondering, even from the disciples' perspective, specifically the ones who are fishermen, as they've seen Jesus talk and walk through things and preach and perform some miracles up to this point, I just wonder, here's how my brain works. Even when I'm around somebody that's incredibly impressive, and again, I've never been around anybody as impressive as Jesus, but there is a sense when I'm around somebody that I have like great admiration for and respect, and they clearly know a lot of things. If they come into a circumstance where I think I have more knowledge of a certain topic or a certain thing, I'm very excited to like put my expertise on display and my prowess out there. And so I'm really fascinated by what they must have felt like, because you have this rabbi pick you up and start doing all these things, teach you all these wild new things, perform all these really cool things, and then he's entering into your domain, and suddenly he has a mastery of your domain that you didn't even know was possible, didn't even know was a thing. And so how they would have processed process that is fascinating. And the fact that they can keep, they're obviously, they're afraid of Jesus in this moment, because like this is something only God does, right? This is something only something Yahweh really does. And so they have some very well earned fear here. But I'm also amazed that this is not like, that this doesn't completely separate them, right? That this isn't like, and there is, like we've talked about before, at different points in the ministry of Jesus, there seems to be some separation, some more closeness at different points between Jesus and the disciples. But I would get the sense where, like, if we're partners in if we're working together, Jason, and suddenly you perform something, this is a miracle, this is astounding, like the natural impulse would be to like completely other you and completely push you into a different sphere. And so the fact that there's something about Jesus that stops that from happening completely, and maybe that's why one of the many reasons why he doesn't exercise his power all the time, is because it's a grace for the disciples for Jesus to still be approachable enough. Because if he was constantly doing this, maybe he wouldn't be as approachable. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think that's totally true. I've often related it to when he reads a room and he knows what they're thinking. I'm like, if I demonstrated to you that I know what you're thinking, well, let me flip it. If you demonstrated to me that, I think we'd spend less time together.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I'm not in a frame of mind to be around you. And then like, and what's your distance? Like, can you read my mind right now?
Sure. Well, and it's also like, oh no, I'm going to see Jason. Wait, no, bad headspace. Call him. Can't, it was a phone call. Is a text message. Does that count as in the same room in this?
Exactly. Well, what amazes me is, Jesus, John 5 says, I can't do anything by myself. I can only do what I see my Father doing, or what my Father directs me to do. And that makes me wonder, is this the first time he's interacted with the weather? And if that's true, in other words, when he was 22, now see, the Spirit entered him when he was baptized. So my sense is he didn't have access to that power until that moment. That may be wrong. Let's say it's wrong. Is he at 22 going, Mom, I'll be back, to Mary, and then going out when there's a storm and he's like just shutting down that one cloud, I'm stopping it from, expelling lightning, or however. There's my ignorance in weather. But it is that idea. Yeah, listener, when you hear this, just assume I'm a child describing anything scientific. But it is that dynamic of, if he's never done it, to stand up with confidence and say, quiet, and I assume he says it loud. I mean, there's no exclamation points in the Greek, but assuming he says, quiet, be still, now we know, because most of us learned as a child that's what's going to happen, but they didn't know. And for that millisecond, did Peter and Andrew be like, what an idiot? Like, oh, you're going to embarrass yourself. Like we are worried about dying, but you're going to look so silly.
Oh, that's good.
Nobody tells a storm to be quiet. That is ridiculous. And I even wonder if you had a complete transcript of their thoughts. They're like, we're going to die. We're going to die. Oh, poor Jesus. Bless his heart. And then it's all calm.
So in another version of this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they asked the question, like, don't you care, teacher, or something like that? Am I right on that one? Yeah.
I think that's this version.
Is it this version?
Yeah, I think it's the Mark 4 where it says, don't
teacher, don't you care? Oh, yeah. I just totally overlooked it.
But that is a good point. Matthew and Luke don't include this accusation.
Yeah.
They're just like, save us.
And I think that being in their headspace would be so fascinating that's the question. That's the question that they go to Jesus with. And yeah, now I'm just realizing for the first time, like maybe this is what perplexes me. What is their expectation for Jesus in this? Are they like, is this guy he let us out in this lake? He let us out here and we're just gonna die and he's gonna sleep, and I've always been fascinated that this question, this very personal question, is at the tip of their tongues, and something that they would focus on. And that, I think, is it's both humanizing and it's also perplexing. The fact that they, in their minds and without the intervention of Jesus, are about to die, and yet the seemingly personal betrayal or nonchalance of Jesus is so at the front of their mind, is so, like, I get it. Like, that's so human. And yet I'm left. I don't know. Maybe I'd feel differently. Maybe I'd feel the exact same. Maybe I'd feel differently. I'm left wondering what were they thinking when they were going through this?
Yeah, no, I totally pick up on that, because if you only had Mark's telling, so John doesn't talk about this, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include this story. If you only had Mark's telling, there's not even a hey, save us. Like Mark or Matthew and Luke are like, save us, and one of them's like, save us, we're going to drown here. That makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. This is almost like, hey, we're going to die, but we don't want to die while you're sleeping.
Yeah.
We want you to be awake and die with us, and we can make the leap easily to care means you're going to save us, but that's not what Mark records here.
Yeah.
And I do think that's really interesting and again, they've not read this story before, mm-hmm. and so that's really important. So what is it they expect, even if they tell him we're drowning?
Yeah.
We're drowning, save us. How would he save you? Like, it's like me getting in a car wreck out there. I'm just loitering in the street for some reason, and somebody whips through, and right before I get hit by the car, I turn to your house, and I'm like, Connor, save me. Like, what am I expecting you to do?
That's a good point.
Well,
and I think this question that they ask, I think it's the core question of the gospel, right? And it says, teacher, don't you care if we drown? Like, isn't that, I mean, at one point or another, we've all looked at God and said, God, don't you care? Like, look around, look at my life, whether it's personal, look at my life, look what I've been through, look what has happened, the pain, the suffering, the sickness, the death, and like, God, don't you care enough to even like move, to show up, to answer a prayer? And I think like this is like God's ultimate answer to that question is sending his son. It's the movement from heaven to earth by his son becoming embodied and actually entering into the presence. And so this question, and I think when we walk through this, you can see Jesus is slowly answering this question over and over and over again. And so maybe that I'm retroactively going back to what amazes me, but now I'm realizing, yeah, this question is for this moment, absolutely. But it's also the question that everyone's hearts pretty much forever have been wondering about God and in Jesus, in his coming, and for the disciples in his waking up in this moment. The answer is like, yes, God does care.
This is what I love about what we're doing right now, and specifically studying with you. And I know you and I both experienced with other people that are really disciples, really learners. Man, God, teach me something today. And I want to learn, and I want to grow. I want you to, I know it may hurt, but I want you to teach me. I didn't notice that. Like I knew the question was there, but I didn't notice, because that's my question right now. Mm-hmm. Before we started recording, I was telling Connor, here are these bad, like within the last 7 days, it's been horrendous. Just specific financial things that have happened that I just feel gutted right now. And I don't have any answers of how to move forward. And so this has been the underlying question to my prayer. And I was sitting in an auto dealership yesterday, and I was like, I'm sure it's going to be okay. And then I come out like, you blew your engine. And I'm like, that is not possible. I know what a blown engine, like I'm an idiot, but I know the basic. I'm like, it's not possible. And I'm like, I'm sure it's going to be okay. They're going to come and say it's made a mistake. And they're like, not a mistake. And I'm like, well, I'm sure it's going to be cheap. It's going to be the one time the recall actually works for me. No recall. It's like, now here's the bill. And then they bring it out to him. I'm like, just bring me my car. And it comes out. And I brought the car fully functioning. And now I'm leaving with it like, it's making so much noise. I know it's going to blow up in the parking lot, Mm-hmm. And I'm like, it didn't sound like that when I got here. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, they're like, we didn't even do anything to it. And I'm like, okay. But the whole thing is, I'm like, God, don't you care about this? Now I knew in that moment that I wasn't going to die, or at least I could easily avoid death. They didn't, And so I'm really grateful that Mark includes that, because I can fully understand hey, we're going to drown. At the very least, it's not fair you're sleeping through our drowning. You need to be awake for this, and we're going to share in the suffering. But I think there's something really tender for me and really universal is a lot of times when I'm struggling with life, that's the question. If I knew God even cared about me, I don't need the answers to all my questions. I'd like to have them. But just knowing God cares about me, that's probably enough most of the time. And I think that's why it's so good this is included.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I also think it's helpful to remind ourselves that again, they're specifically talking about this specific circumstance where they're worried about their death and they're worried about Jesus sleeping through it, and also possibly dying. Him, I don't know what they think is going to happen to Jesus, but I think it is important to own the factual statement that not only before this are they asking the existential question, does God care enough to rescue us from Rome, or does God care enough to rescue us from sin, or does God care enough to rescue us from death? They are with Jesus, and they're still they're with the embodiment of God caring. Like, God can't care more than Jesus being with you, and they're still like, God, don't you care? And we had they probably pushed us along the lines that we were going to study today, but we had a circumstance where I was sharing with Jason something that happened to me, and through his kind of just talking through it with me, he helped me see that there's a moment where the presence of God was tangibly on my shoulders. Like, I felt the presence of God, and because of some distractions, I never even realized that the God of the universe had moved towards me, and I missed out on that in the moment, and we processed this through. But it's giving me some grace to recognize the God of the universe moved towards the disciples, were in the presence of the disciples, and they still missed it at certain points. So that being said, Jason, what perplexes you as we wrap up?
Yeah, the thing, and this is a word thing, we don't usually land on these things, but in verse 36, it's such a fascinating thing. I don't think the other Gospels include this, but it says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was. Okay. And then it says there were also other boats with him. Now, spoiler, they never mention those other boats again. Like, do those other boats get lost? Because when they land on the other side of this lake, there is no record of other boats being there. So did these guys drown, the other boats? And I'm like, why even bring it up? And I say that to say this. There are times when there'll be phrases that you're like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that's why you'll be reading the scripture and you'll be like, I know I've read the scripture 100 times, but I never saw that. And I think that's part of the word being living and active. And then I also think when I encounter those verses, now keep in mind, I may do 5 minutes of study and realize, oh, of course, this is why. You know what I mean? Read how other things translate it and think, oh, that's the reason. But I think it's important to point out, as I process that, do you know why that's in there? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not assuming it's irrelevant. I'm not assuming it's scrap. Like, why do you include this? Mark was so dumb. I'm assuming there's value there in those words, and I have no clue what it means. It doesn't seem to add to the scripture at all. But the way I read scripture is he hasn't taught me it yet. And he may teach me it because I'm going to study it this afternoon, or he may teach me it because, I don't know, I see a commercial 12 years from now, or I, have an experience. I'm like, oh, just as he was. Exactly. And I'm just pointing that out, that thinking that effective scripture study is mastery, it's just false.
Yeah.
This is much more about showing up and saying, okay, I'm trusting you, God, teach me something, than to say, I'm going to master this whole thing. And it's just a gentle reminder. This doesn't make or break it, but I don't want to go past those words and not say, I have no idea why he's telling us that, what's the significance, and what, a year from now I may learn that'll make that really pop into life. But I know he's so good, it could happen.
Yeah. Love your overall point. I also don't know. That is very intriguing. And yeah, I don't know. We'll be interested. I'm going to go do some research on that, because there does not seem to be any easily available answer for that. But anyways, thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.